So understand that the human body will not use all of the motor units, especially if the individual is an untrained individual. Our body looks for the path of least resistance at all times. Between this output, right there, that difference is equal to fatigue. What's going on, everybody? It's Hopper again. We got Brutus. We got the Ultimate Warrior. We're in the house.
We take it to the house. Take it to the house. Take it to the house.
We're ready to go. We got another great topic for you. Today, we will discuss why Jiu-Jitsu is so tiring, especially for beginners. So this topic is intriguing as there can be a fair amount of information to discuss with this idea of fatigue and Jiu-Jitsu and combat sports in general. There's usually a beginning part when people partake in Jiu-Jitsu where it's usually in the first 6 months, year and a half, 2 years, to where people get pretty fatigued, more than usual, to the point where it becomes a conversation out on the mats. It becomes a conversation that you can see happen on Instagram videos about how people discuss how they're so tired, they're so fatigued.
I found him like this in the bathroom, Your Honor. Somebody beat the hell out of him.
And for years, they ran regularly. They competed in cross country or marathons. And for some reason, when they just come in and do Jiu-Jitsu, it's so much more tiring than it should be. And there's a lot of physiological reasons as to what happens when people go and train Jiu-Jitsu, regardless of your physical state. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to define a few terms and discuss a few ideas. The idea of physical fitness is extremely relative, and what's physically fit to one person is different than what's physically fit to another person. For example, if a person runs a mile in 7 minutes, that could be their personal best. However, if someone runs a mile in 7 minutes, that could just be a warm-up, or they could run 5 miles in a row at 7-minute pace. So people always throw around this term, oh, I'm not in good shape, I'm not in good shape. Well, again, those are relative terms, relative ideas.
You out of shape?
When we look at fitness and strength conditioning and working out, the idea is to simply generate an overload on a system, whether that system is a cell, the nervous system, muscles, the cardiac tissue in our hearts. We want to generate an overload. And people have a tendency to come into Jiu-Jitsu and they think that, oh, I'm in good shape, which is true. And that is common. There's nothing wrong with that. To have a good state of physical fitness where you can run, where you can walk, where you can hike, those concepts are good to go. However, there's a shift in your physiological responses when we enter into a new environment. And that's where some of the misconceptions, and maybe we can use the term confusion, for lack of a better phrase, will be thrown around. And it really has nothing to do with someone's state of physical fitness. Now, if someone just comes off the couch and they go and try Jiu-Jitsu regularly several times a week for 3 or 4 months, it's gonna be a challenge. It's gonna be difficult. So as we move forward, let's define a few terms. So the first thing that I want to discuss is what's called a motor neuron. So a motor neuron is the attachment from the spine to the muscle. So I'll add some graphs and charts here at the bottom. And for the sake of brevity, I'll just draw a couple of rough pictures up here. So if we have your brain, we've got your spinal column, and down here is your cerebellum. If we draw an attachment off the spine, and here's your muscle, there's usually going to be several attachments off of one of these motor neurons. And the spine comes back into here, and the motor neuron comes in and attaches to the tissue, and then we come back to the spine again, and then another motor neuron comes off and attaches to the tissue. Think of these as like fishing line.
What do you call that? But ugly. Give me that pole.
And it comes off again and attaches here. Some muscles have more motor neurons than other muscles, so the quadriceps have way more motor neurons than the muscles in your eye.
You look great.
And these motor neurons send the signal to the tissue to tell it to contract. And that signal is acetylcholine, ACH. And these motor neurons are attached to a certain amount of muscle fibers. So let's say this motor neuron right here has 17 fibers. And this motor neuron down here, this attachment, let's say it's got 32 fibers. This one right here has 56. This one has 14. So the motor neuron and the attachments that it has, let's say it has 32 fibers. So the motor neuron and the 32 fibers together, that's called a motor unit. So understand that the human body will not use all of the motor units, especially if the individual is an untrained individual. Our body looks for the path of least resistance at all times. So if our muscles can get away with the usage of only maybe 2 or 3 of these motor units, that's what it will do. However, if stress and stimuli is placed on these muscles, your body will start to require more of these motor units to activate and meet the demand of that stimulus. So we're going to dig a little deeper here into the motor neuron. And when we look at the motor neuron itself, if we're looking down on the spinal column and through here, there's like a Batman kind of like looking signal right here. And the motor neuron kind of comes off and it attaches to the tissue. So we're zoomed in. Here's the muscle, and the measurement of the acetylcholine in through here is typically negative 70 millivolts. That's the resting membrane potential of a particular motor neuron. And if we were to have a graph, we have the negative 70. And when this signal is sent to the tissues to tell it to contract, the signal then goes up to about plus 40 when an action potential is sent from the spine to the tissue. So the charge is sitting here at about negative 70 millivolts, and then when an action potential occurs, it spikes up and then it declines. It repolarizes back to negative 70. So an action potential is just a brief change in the resting membrane potential. And it sends that acetylcholine and it tells the actin right here and the myosin fibers to slide past each other and contract like this. Those of you that have any questions, put the questions in the comments below. I will answer them as soon as possible. And again, I'll also put some references in the description as well as charts right here. So that's your motor neuron. That's the resting membrane potential, and it climbs up to about plus 40 when there's an action potential, and then it repolarizes back down. With that said, let's say an individual goes and tries something new, an environment that they've never done before. It could be salsa dancing. It could be something a little bit more stressful like water polo.
Logan!
Or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Crawl atop me and meet your doom.
Their body is going to be in what's called an alarm reaction response. Right here. So your alarm reaction response. Brand new stimulus, something that they've never done before. Lost my train of thought.
We don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents.
Again, your body will always try to meet the demands of any stimulus that we give it. So now all of a sudden an individual goes and tries to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. They immediately start to move into a little bit of a fight or flight scenario. Although a maxed out 100% fight or flight scenario would have a little bit more of a different physiological response where the GTOs come into play. I talked about Golgi tendon organs in a previous video. I'll put a card to that right up here. So that way, if anyone wants to go back and study the Golgi tendon organs, So this alarm reaction response puts this individual in a bit of a fight or flight scenario. And what starts to happen when this alarm reaction response is heart rate will increase, motor unit recruitment increases. So you've got these muscles that have all these attachments from the tissue. So if an individual only needed, these are the motor neurons coming from the spine. So if an individual only needed this motor neuron and this motor neuron, I'll write that in green right there, for their day-to-day activities, and now all of a sudden they place themselves into an environment that's unfamiliar, their body as a survival mechanism will start to recruit more, this one, maybe this one, more motor neurons to help meet the demand. So now all of a sudden you have an increased heart rate, an increased demand for oxygen, more motor unit recruitment, and then of course the individual will probably start to sweat more because the skin has those thermoreceptors. So you've got the thermoreceptors in the skin that sense the change in heat. I also have another video on sweating. I'll put a card for it right here. So these thermoreceptors in the skin sense the change in heat, and now that negative feedback loop kicks in and the sweating starts to occur even more because they're in such a state of shock, a new stimulus. And now your body has to contend with all of these three concepts and this new stimulus, and the fatigue is going to set in dramatically. So the next thing we need to define and discuss is fatigue. So I'll put a diagram for fatigue down here as well. If we take a graph right here, if we have time as the independent variable, and then you have your force output, which will be your dependent variable. If we have force of a muscle coming up through here like this, sorry about that, it made a noise, and then we come down. So this would be a muscle contraction. And we have a particular output right about here. And then as time moves on, let's say we do another maximum force contraction, got the big biceps like Brutus over here, up and down. So this second curve of the force output is not as high as this force output. So the difference between this output right there, that difference is equal to fatigue. And that's how we can define fatigue. Fatigue does not necessarily mean that we are done with the workout or that we are tired. It's just a decrease in the force capacity of the tissue. If the beginning of your workout, you're curling 135 pounds, and then 5 minutes later, maybe you can only curl 120 pounds, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're tired. You just have fatigue. So towards the end of a session or an hour of hard training, always account for your muscular fatigue to help prevent injuries while you're in the gym. That is critical. So back to this idea of fatigue, now that we've defined it, this decrease in your force capacity as we've had all of those muscles with those motor neurons active, because it's such a new stimulus, all these motor neurons are all crazy active now. This one's used, this one's used, this one's used, and let's say the person only needed one of them for their daily activities. The decrease in the force capacity is much more vast, much more constant because of that alarm reaction response, because it's a new environment. Over time, as the individual adapts, they start to build skill sets and the efficiency starts to increase, their fatigue levels of training jiu-jitsu will start to settle down a little bit. Now, if an individual decides to train hard and do higher rates of jiu-jitsu, is a different idea. It's a different story. Someone can certainly become fatigued by the rate at which they perform jiu-jitsu, and they can do that purposely to garner an overload. So when we look at the purpose of training is to garner an overload. So if you have time and you have your overload, an individual will have their level of fitness and then the overload. And then as they adapt to that, then they have the level of fitness and then their overload, and it continues on. So if an individual purposely does jiu-jitsu at higher rates to stress out the cardiovascular system more, is different than when an individual first starts jiu-jitsu and their body's in that alarm reaction response, and so many more of their motor units have been recruited. Unfortunately, it can be a little bit more inefficient because they're trying so hard and they're using so much muscular tension, and people say, oh, this jiu-jitsu is so tiring. I've never been this tired before in my life. I can't believe how tired jiu-jitsu makes me. That's actually not valid. What makes an individual so fatigued is the fact that it's an alarm reaction response. This would happen to me, this would happen to any individual if someone put me into water polo, which I've never played, or rock climbing, which I don't do. Any new stimulus that you give somebody, your body will always go to that alarm reaction response. It will increase the heart rate in attempts to meet any demand of oxygen that we might need. And it will also increase that motor unit recruitment, the neural drive to those tissues, in attempts to meet any possible demand. Jiu-jitsu is special, it's phenomenal. It's similar to wrestling. Wrestling is phenomenal, it's special, but that's not what makes people tired. What makes people tired is the new stimulus, the elevated heart rate, and all that excess neural drive. Over time, as people develop the skills, they will eventually move from that limbic system of the brain, which is right here, which, depending on what you believe, is more of the primitive and older portion of the brain that's responsible for protecting your land, protecting your territory, food, hunger, sex drive.
Giggity.
The jiu-jitsu will arguably move from the limbic system and move more into the frontal cortex, where we have more of our reasoning, where we don't really need to use that grit and use all that excess muscular tension, and we won't be as fatigued simply from squeezing our body, but just doing the jiu-jitsu at a much more relaxed state. So that's it for this video. This is why people have a tendency to get so fatigued, especially for beginner jiu-jitsu athletes. Again, it is not you. Physical fitness is relative. Doing cardiovascular activity, yes, that will help, but just understand, if you're newer to jiu-jitsu, you can define new anywhere from 0 to 3 to 4 to 5 years. If you're newer, that alarm reaction response might still be a little prevalent, and we might resort to using that limbic system and squeezing those tissues rather than that frontal cortex and our reasoning part of the brain. And eventually, you'll be able to conquer that, and it won't be such a new stimulus to where you're gritting like that. So yes, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. For those of you that have any questions, always please feel free to send me an email. My contact information is in below. For those of you that wish to support this channel, there are also links below for donations. Hit the like button.
Yeah, come on, push your button.
Otis needs it. He's trying to look like One-Eyed Willie. And Brutus loves it when you hit the like button. He's like bad medicine. Bad medicine is what I need. Brutus, you give love a bad name. And we will see you all next time.